what we can try and make sure that our declaration will capture the essence of all the discussions across all the commissions. So thank you very much for your patience, and a big round of applause to yourselves for being so patient. Thank you so much. We've come to that point. We are ready with the declaration, which will indicate all the discussions across all the commissions, as well as all the issues that were raised in the plenary. Thank you so much. We will allow the General Secretary of the KCC to present the declaration to ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Program Director. Program Director did apologize, and I want to re-emphasize that. But this is the critical part of the summit. It's not Monday when we started, it won't be tomorrow, it wasn't yesterday, it's today. Because what we do now is we conclude, and we take together what you have done over the last few days, your thoughts, your ideas, what you've shared, we put that together in the format of a declaration. When we go through the declaration, we took into consideration various source documents. So the declaration is not only a reflection of the commissions and the outcomes of the commissions. Yes, the document will reflect what was discussed in the commissions, and those recommendations from the commissions that was adopted in the plenary, which is relevant to the declaration, will be in the declaration and will reflect in the declaration. But there are also recommendations from the commissions, which is operational, and which needs to be dealt with through an operational process. So those out of the summit report, those will go to council, and we will deal with them in terms of operationalizing those discussions and decisions from the commissions that we need to put into operation in a practical process through the PSUC. Then we also took into consideration the plenary presentations, as well as the addresses that was made by the Minister of Public Service and Administration, the Minister of Finance, President of NEHAW, DG of DPSA. So we took out of those presentations that was made, we also took what was important and what was raised and what is critical, and we also added that part to the declaration. And then there is parts in the declaration that comes from the summit papers, from the position papers that partners have submitted, which is also complementary to the discussions. So some of them is also included in the declaration in itself. So if as a commission we don't find all of your recommendations there, please do understand the explanation that I've just given. Also considering that this declaration goes into a process now. This declaration, there will be an implementation plan, which there's a task team that has been set up that will now formulate an implementation plan for the declaration. So when the declaration goes to council, it goes with an implementation plan. And when the declaration is adopted by council, such implementation plan is also adopted by council, which will ensure that we don't come back in 2024 and we argue about the implementation of the declaration or the non-implementation of the declaration in itself. So it will follow that when it goes to council, we will also deal with the issue of the implementation plan. Also important, this is a draft declaration. There has been inputs from all of the role players, and we are actually excited that everybody was involved in terms of the final discussion of the document. But this will still be subject to a process in council. We will now table this as the outcome of the summit, and parties will still have the opportunity to debate and to talk to issues in council before we sign a collective agreement on this document for implementation through the council. Also, people, I told you in the week, my home language is isiZulu. I don't understand all English, and I don't understand all the Queen's language that is there. The teachers that is here, the document still needs to be cleaned up. There are still tenses that we need to correct, there's still commas that we need to correct, full punctuation that needs to be done. Please, that will be done. We don't have to now get into that nitty-gritty of the grammar and the English in itself, but we will make sure that that is also corrected as and when we finally adopt the declaration. Reading of the declaration is going to take a minute or two. It is a document of 10 pages, and I do ask for your indulgence, but it's important that we place on record exactly what it is that we wanted to achieve and bring that out in the declaration. What you will also find in the declaration is that the declaration speaks to all four pillars or all four spheres that the Minister mentioned on Monday. It speaks to the government, it speaks to public servants, it speaks to citizens, it speaks to trade unions, so it speaks to all of those aspects. So it's important for us to give a report back in detail on that issue itself. We therefore, as a preamble to this declaration, therefore declare that the parties to the Public Service Summit on Collective Bargaining held at Emperor's Palace Conference Center in Gauteng from the 28th to the 31st of March 2022 hereby declare and commit the principles, objectives, and agreements set out in this declaration. The parties gathered for the summit under the theme Strengthening and Defending Centralized Collective Bargaining to advance economic development, social justice, a capable and developmental state, labour peace, and the democratization of the workplace. Our authority for gathering here is from resolution or the Birchwood Agreement, commonly referred to as Birchwood 1, which was signed in 2009, where the agreement in principle required parties to develop and strengthen collective bargaining as to underline the importance of the characteristics of a developmental state. These principles were further confirmed in from the Birchwood 1 agreement was confirmed in the declaration on the Public Service Summit signed in 2010, which we also refer to as Resolution 6 of 2010. On the adoption of the declaration on the Public Service Summit, the PSCBC was required in terms of clause 4.9 of the agreement to call for a Public Service Summit on collective bargaining to strengthen the PSCBC, and that is what we have done. The parties to this summit on collective bargaining and the advance of economic development, social justice, a capable and developmental state, labour peace, and democratization of the workplace aims to give effect to the collective agreement signed in the past and not yet implemented, further reviewing of past performance and future ventures in enhancing collective bargaining in the public sector. In clause 2 of this declaration, we have a clause that speaks to acknowledgements. These are issues that we acknowledge, but they may not always be implementable. And these are things that we strive by or that we want to work by. We learned from Resolution 6 of 2010 when we placed some of these things into the resolution, and that made the resolution very difficult to implement. But we acknowledge that we need to resource the public service and reaffirm the commitments made in PSCBC Resolution 6 of 2010. Further, parties are not opposed to the reconfiguration of government, where such reconfiguration will result in job security, improved conditions of work, and improvement of service delivery initiatives to the citizenry. The dire implication of the systemic corruption within government and support. The summit acknowledges the dire implication of the systemic corruption within government and support measures to strengthen anti-corruption legislation and initiatives, including the full implementation of the relevant provisions of the Labour Relations Act. The summit acknowledges a deep concern with the developmental challenges of the plight of communities that they serve, of which is committed to fight poverty, disease, corruption, inequality, and unemployment. And the summit acknowledges the need to avoid any attack on collective bargaining and agree to jealously guard and entrench the principles of centralized collective bargaining. Clause 3 of this declaration emphasizes the specific resolutions that is applicable in terms of the implementation of the declaration and also being able to allow us to operationalize the declaration in its totality. Clause 4 is the declaration. And as parties here gathered under the theme, pronounces and the principles and objectives set out in this declaration. On creating a framework to strengthen and defend centralized collective bargaining and agreeing on the implementation of outstanding agreements within Council resolutions, parties resolve as follows. The PSCBC should review collective bargaining structures in the public service through a collaborative venture with the ILO has to be guided by international best practices. The review to be undertaken in clause 4.2.1 should give due consideration to the public sector in general, which includes public administration, state agencies, entities, and non-commercial parastatals, also including a methodology to overcome legislative challenges. Giving effect to PSCC Resolution 6 of 2010, a public sector summit should be arranged by 2024, which should include all spheres of government and public entities. The PSCC must without delay establish a task team that will audit all collective agreements since 2010 to identify areas of non-implementation and agree on a clear process for the implementation of the outstanding areas linked to a time frame for completion of the proposed implementation strategies. The PSCC as the coordinating council must, through the monitoring and evaluation unit, conduct a compliance audit on the implementation of signed collective agreements across all of the sector councils. The PSCC must conclude the implementation of its enforcement procedures and must ensure that the constitution of sector councils have provisions for effective and efficient enforcement of collective agreements. The PSCC must define the concept of issues regulated by uniform rules, norms and standards that apply across the public service as given in the Labour Relations Act. This will assist the sector councils in understanding and defining their role in strengthening centralised collective bargaining. The PSCC must review its constitution to reinforce the principles of centralised collective bargaining. Sectors may buy into a process of amending their constitutions as to ensure it subscribes to the concept of centralised collective bargaining in line with the reviewed PSCC constitution. The PSCC should set up a cross-sectoral task team to undertake this process. There should be a reversing of the fragmentation of the public service occasioned by the privatisation of service delivery and outsourcing of functions. Parties therefore agree that government should conduct a spending review on the cost of at least 3 selected agencies vis-a-vis departmental divisions and a further spending review of at least 3 selected large outsourcing contracts where outsourced functions would be insourced. One such must be a private-public partnership initiative. The outcome of this must be tabled in the PSCC for discussion. In the interim, government should consider not to undertake any new outsourcing or creation of agencies where the functions of such could be linked to the socio-economic service delivery initiatives until the case studies have been or has been completed and discussed in the PSCC. There's a need to upskill negotiators in the PSCC through grooming of new teams of negotiators for the future. The PSCC should approach institutions like the ILO and the National School of Government to assist with capacity building initiatives. Parties expressed their concern that the slow implementation of the Government Employees Housing Scheme that directly impacts on the human dignity of public servants. The PSCC Committee on the Government Employees Housing Scheme should implement these provisions within 6 weeks. The PSCC Committee on GHS will approach the GEPF and the PIC to conduct a feasibility study on a funding model for affordable and accessible housing products for public servants. On issues of GEMS, parties must ensure the full implementation of PSCC Resolution 4 of 2017, giving effect to the transformation of GEMS, allowing the board to reflect the demographics of the membership of the scheme. The transformation should also enhance and expedite provisions for the implementation of the NHI. Product development in GEMS must improve the healthcare benefits of its members, and funding for those benefits should be prioritized from the savings incurred by the scheme. Parties mandate GEMS to undertake a study to ensure a staff complement suitable to build capacity and capability to insource its administrative functions that would result in cost savings for the scheme. On the issue of mandating, parties agreed that the employer would present to the PSCC a document on the review and strengthening of the mandating process, alignment of role and responsibilities, the Minister of Public Service and Administration, Minister of Finance, Cabinet and Ministers in the mandating committee. For future negotiations, the employer will be required to issue a certificate of compliance to guarantee that all legal processes has been followed and that sufficient funding would be available for the implementation of the collective agreement. Parties agreed to practically work towards the alignment and timing of the annual budgetary processes of government with aligning of the processes of government with the PSCBC wage negotiation processes to ensure that the final budget envelope on the compensation of employees in the national budget reflects the signed council's wage agreements with inception of the 2024-2025 financial year going forward. On the second issue, we're considering the professionalization of the public service through the implementation of the Public Service Charter and the commitment to the resourcing of the public service to allow public servants to effectively deliver services to the citizenry. Parties have resolved as follows. Every public service employee must individually and severely embrace values that include loyalty, neutrality, transparency, diligence, punctuality, effectiveness, and impartiality. The concept of public values and ethics should be introduced as part of school and tertiary curriculum to build a cohort of citizens and public servants who are ethical, selfless, and values-driven. Parties must engage on forging a career pathing system that supports upskilling and reskilling of public servants for impartial opportunities of recruitment and promotion. Introduction of pre-employment training and development of all aspiring public servants at managerial level and in relevant professional occupations, similar to aspirant attorneys first passing the attorneys board exams before they are allowed to practice. Promotion into leadership positions in the public service should be grounded on principles of technical competence, qualifications plus proven effective experience, integrity, responsibility, accountability, transparency, and commitment to the eradication of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Therefore, recruitment and selection instruments should be broadened to address the different elements of professionalism. Ethics training is necessary to inculcate ethical decision-making into the organizational structure and to reinforce ethical choices and accountability. The code of conduct should be supported with a framework to deal with corrective action. Public service occupations should be mapped, catalogued, in order to identify the well-established and emerging professions that exist in the public service, as well as the levels and benefits of external professionalization linkages. Considering a continuous professional development point system through the different CETAs to further studies and create a culture of lifelong learning. Parties encourage association with professional bodies linked to specific occupational classes, and then it lists those professional bodies identified. These bodies are not limited, but they are identified as examples. 4.3.11, the organizational structures of departments must be reviewed to ensure adherence to mandate and that public servants will be able to deliver services by reducing overlapping functions. The state must, as an enabler, ensure proper service delivery by filling vacant posts and positions in the public service, prioritizing frontline services. The state must resource the public servants with adequate tools of trade that will allow the delivery of services. Parties agreed to build the capacity of supervisors to enable them to better manage discipline in the public service and accountability. In delivering a professional service, public servants must distance themselves from doing business with the state. The PSCBC is to undertake an empirical study on key frontline public services, comparing the levels of pay between equivalent professional occupations in the public and private sectors, with a view to close the gaps to retain experienced personnel and attract suitably qualified professionals into the public service. Recognizing that over the past decade, consolidated spending by government on goods and services has been in excess of the average economic growth rate and average inflation rate, which means that there is no spending ceiling and it's unaffordable. Also taking into account of the fact that corruption, fruitless and wasteful expenditure in departments and entities significantly occur through the channel of tenders and outsourcing under the budget item of goods and services. The National Treasury is mandated to undertake a review on consolidated government spending on goods and services, including on large outsourcing contracts in which the public service functions can be insourced and existing internal capacity must be utilized. This exercise is intended to ensure value for money, prevent corruption, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and to make resource available to relieve the burden of the Treasury's fiscal consolidation on the wages of public servants under the PSCBC. The DPSA must review and advise on the macro configuration of the state, including the alignment of compensation of employees' budgets across the public sector. On the next issue, the issue of enhancing public service through the optimal use of the fourth industrial revolution and the digitization of the public service, parties have resolved that government must strengthen systems and processes as well as internal infrastructure resources. Government must re-engineer departmental capabilities to ensure consistent production of reliable, factual, timely and accurate data and information outputs, such as having data and information assets readily available for quick and sound decision-making, allowing the public sector institutions to be proactive and reactive in solving service delivery challenges and assist in finding feasible, sustainable and innovative public service delivery solutions. Invest in research, development and innovation activities, programs and projects that can be utilized as stepping stones in processes. New digital technologies will incrementally change the size, shape and skill composition of the personnel in the public service. Amidst the prevalent excitement with new digital technologies, there has been sporadic and ill-advised procurement of digital technologies and services in a number of departments and entities that have led to corruption, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. As a custodian of the public service, the DPSA must work with Treasury to develop a regulatory framework for the procurement process and digital technologies that are above a determined threshold of rand value, requiring a standardized business case justifying spending on such procurement and supported by technical evaluation by CITA. With such procurement has negative implications for labour, organised labour must be consulted and the department or entity concerned must attach a skill upgrade plan and or a redeployment plan to the business case. Council must establish a task team to guide them on the implementation of the principles raised in clauses 443 and 444. Leverage multi-stakeholder partnerships, e-participation and e-governance, skills development, access to infrastructure, research and development, entrepreneurship and localization, labour market restructuring and the reducing of high cost of access to services. For workers to remain relevant, the upskilling and reskilling of the workforce on the fourth IR is not an option but a necessity. There is a need to relook into the norms and standards, basic conditions of service and the development guidelines for the measuring of performance, rewards and incentives. On the last part of the declaration, looking at recognizing the role of women, youth and people with disabilities in the workplace, providing the necessary support to allow for equal opportunities and eradicating of practices of discrimination, harassment and victimization. Furthermore, to recognize the role of women in being the primary caregiver of their families through the implementation of the basic child care policy. Parties have resolved as follows. The summit recognizes that the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment, that's Convention 190, states amongst others the following. Recognizing the right of everyone to a world of work free from violence and harassment, including gender-based violence and harassment. And recognizing that violence and harassment in the world of work can constitute a human rights violation or abuse, and that violence and harassment is a threat to equal opportunities, is unacceptable and incompatible with decent work. And recognizing the importance of a work culture based on mutual respect of dignity of the human being to prevent violence and harassment. The summit further resolved to undertake a collaborative process of ensuring compliance to Convention 190 of the ILO. The summit resolves that we need to allow for a fair representation of women, persons with disability, and youth in the structures of council, inclusive of provincial chambers and governance structures. Developing women, persons with disability, and the youth to allow them to occupy roles and positions that will enhance the overall recognition of these individuals. Develop training and capacity building programs to address how matters related to mental health and psychosocial issues are dealt with in the workplace. And lastly, parties commit to develop and implement a program aimed at strengthening the role of women negotiators, a leadership development, coaching and mentoring program to be implemented in the 2022-2023 financial year. Therefore, in conclusion of this summit and in conclusion of this declaration, parties reaffirms their commitment to fight against all forms of corruption and maladministration in the public service, and those who are found guilty of corruption must face the full might of the law. Thank you, Mr. Program Director.
Thank you very much, General Secretary. Big round of applause to the General Secretary for this presentation. I want to believe that the way it was presented leaves no stone no room for changes and so forth. And I want to believe that we are at that stage where we can move for the adoption of this declaration. Unless if there are questions of clarities, unless if there are issues that we want to raise, just to clarify what is in there. Yeah, I think all of us agree to the declaration. Let me note the President of NEHAWU.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the team that have worked to compile this declaration. We rise to support it to be adopted by the summit and further propose that the first meeting of the Council must develop a clear roadmap and implementation plan immediately. That it shouldn't just be a declaration, but as a resolution of this summit, in the first meeting of the Council, which should be convened soon, we must conclude an implementation plan and a time frame. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. There is a proposal for the acceptance of the do we have the state concurring?
Thank you very much, Jones. I wanted to displace you and face the summit to say thank you very much. Over the last few days, we have sat here for 4 solid days, working on trying to improve our country and trying to improve the public service. I see some people are laughing at me because they know my tears are very close. But I must say this has been one of the most successful summits of the PSCBC and that I've ever attended. Everybody here put shoulder to the wheel. All the trade unions put their best foot forward. The civil servants that came with me here displayed excellent camaraderie with Labour. But I would also like to thank the ministers that were here with us. throughout these days. Minister Kodongwane, for the support that he has always given ever since he arrived in his post to ensure that the relationship between labor and the employer becomes a relationship that is constructive, that is productive, and that is positive. In his absence, I would really like to thank him from the bottom of my heart. And dare I say, I would like to thank him on behalf of Labour, because a lot of the things that he said appear in the declaration, meaning that we have a Minister of Finance that listens to the needs of the employees, but also those of the employer. I'd like to say thank you very much to the team that worked on the declaration in support of what the President of NEHAWU has said. But I'm not sure. I suppose he stands here speaking on behalf of Labour rather than speaking on behalf of NEHAWU. I see a note at the back there. Thank you very much. You have acquitted yourselves very well as patriotic citizens, and I know that our country will be in safe hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that endorsement. Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this summit. I want to thank you once more. A big round of applause to yourselves as we close the summit. So the summit has come to an end. It's now declared closed. Thank you very much.